I am Deb Kristensen. I'm a lawyer at Givens, Pursley in Boise, and I have spent a good portion of the last 2 years of my life working almost exclusively representing dairymen up in the Yakama Valley in Washington. And that is because they have been involved in a case that I've been asked to talk about a little bit today, to bring to your attention for a couple of different reasons. Because of the potential impact on anyone involved in animal ag. And frankly, as you will come to see, and I hope not to scare you too much, because I have to talk about this case, which is a little scary once you understand it, for really all of farming. So with that, let me give you an overview very quickly. I will leave time at the end, hopefully, for questions. And so far, you guys haven't been a real inquisitive group. So I don't know how much time I should leave, but I will go through this. And if you have questions maybe along the way, if I trigger a question for you, please raise your hand. Don't wait for the end. I'm going to just give you, this is my kind of my overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. The Yakama Valley, what's going on there, my clients, the EPA and their very significant involvement in and around the Yakama Valley, looking at specifically nitrates in groundwater. And I'll talk a little bit about the history of that and what the EPA has done and how my clients have been impacted about that, the specific dairies at issue. And then you're going to see this term over and over, RCRA, RCRA. That stands for the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. It is its own environmental statute that many of you might not have heard about before because until recently it was not applied to agriculture. It has always been used in other industrial in hazardous waste kind of materials. And I'll talk a little bit about what's going on with that. The specific lawsuits in federal court over in Yakama. Judge Rice, who's our judge applying to all the cases, and his significant decision that was entered just this last January, so just a few months ago. And then what hopefully can be done to minimize other producers against this type of liability that may be coming your way. And I fear that it already has started to spread. So, already been around. I know there are at least 3 people on the attendance list from the Washington State Department of Ag. If you're one of them, can you raise your hand if you're in the room? We got 2 people, so you know where Yakama is. For everybody else, here's a real quick primer. Yakama is not on the wet side of the state. Everything on the west side of the Cascades is like Seattle. You think of Seattle, other than coffee, what do you think of? Rain, right? Not in the Yakama Valley, not on the east side. It's very, very dry. And in fact, there's about 8 inches of annual rainfall in and around Yakama. And according to my experts, and I don't even profess to be one, the evapotranspiration rate, if I've said that right, is more than 20 inches per year. So more moisture is being evaporated than rainfall coming down. It's very much a desert kind of environment. So that's the Yakama Valley. That's where it is. So most of the water, obviously, that is going there is coming from irrigation and various canals and the rivers that are in that area. Despite its kind of arid environment, there's a very long history of agriculture in the Yakama Valley. I'm a huge wine drinker, or wine lover. Let's say not drinker. There is a very much growing industry, a wine industry in and around the Yakama Valley, making amazing wines. If you don't know about Washington wines, check it out. That's my advice for today. But they're also growing lots of hops for beer. And really and that's the most recent events. What they're really known for is tree fruit. There's apples are a big deal in Washington, and Yakama County is the #1 county for producing apples in all of Washington. So ag has been around for a long time. And in fact, animal agriculture has been around for a very long time in and around Yakama. From what I'm able to find out, starting way back in 1850 is when the first cattle ranchers came to the valley. And, it's gone up and down over the years about what's going on, but that's pretty much what it looks like. It's a beautiful, beautiful valley with the river, the Yakama River, and this great valley, and then off to the west you see Mount Adams, this beautiful mountain most of the time. Now, animal ag is regulated by the Washington State Department of Ag. And they have dairy nutrient management plans, which I know many of your states have various iterations of that. And in fact, the dairies that I represent all have these dairy nutrient management plans, which specify how, in fact, they will use, handle, and store the manure at their facilities. So that's what's going on there. This map is very hard to read, and the red just represents cities. The dots represent various nitrate concentrations that were found over the years. The yellow is data collected between 1990 and 2000, and the green represents data from 2001 to 2010. And the only reason I give you this map is to give you a visual about how nitrates are not concentrated in one area, but rather are spread throughout the valley. This is not a site-specific issue for this valley. There have been nitrates in high concentrations and low concentrations, but nitrates nonetheless in groundwater in the Yakama Valley for many, many years, and they're spread throughout the valley. Oops. That's associated with everything. Over on the yellow towards the left is where the Yakama Nation, the Indian reservation is. Just to give you some, I don't have any cities out here. I'm just trying to show you an overall. This is crops. This is septic systems. This is dairies. This is everything in the entire valley is represented in this particular thing. And the only reason I give you red is because that's where the actual municipalities are, so that's more likely to be municipal septic systems than out in the more rural areas. So, given the history of high nitrates in and around the Yakama Valley, people started getting concerned about what's going on with their groundwater. And as I say here, in 2008, the local newspaper, the Yakama Herald, decided to do a series of newspaper articles talking about the issue of high nitrates in groundwater. And just to give you a benchmark, you'll hear the number 10 MCL. That is the maximum contaminant level that's measured to be the level of concern from the EPA. Any wells measured below 10 are considered to be safe. Anything above 10 is obviously the level that people get concerned. So the Yakama Herald wrote an article saying, look, there's many wells. I don't remember the exact percentage, but I'm going to make it up, and don't quote me. It's 20-something% of the wells in the Yakama Valley are above 10. This is a real issue. Somebody should be paying attention. It doesn't feel like anybody is. And they got the attention through some environmental groups of the EPA. And they went to the EPA and they said, you need to do something about this. You need to do a study. EPA was able to get some funding by designating the Yakama Valley as an environmental justice showcase community, which usually means trouble for animal ag, but they got, we've heard numbers as much as $1 million to do this study, and the study confirmed there are high nitrates in groundwater in various wells in the Yakama Valley. That really was never disputed. The problem that happened with this is instead of saying that there are many causes, and I think all dairymen, all people in ag agree there are many causes for nitrates in groundwater, this report really tried to just point the finger singularly at dairies. Dairies are the cause of this problem. And dairies have always said, look, we may be part of the problem, but we're not the only problem. We have to look at a holistic approach. They had the local conservation district, and they put together a groundwater management group and kind of a community effort to try and collectively bring all the players together to say, how is we as a community can we address this problem and get some procedures in place, some technology in place, what have you, but not just single out one dairy in one place, realizing that there's a whole community of potential contributors. The EPA said, no, it's really these dairies. And for reasons I still don't know to this day, they picked out 5 dairies as being the ones that they wanted to really focus on. And those are my dairies. And what the EPA then did with this report is they went to these 5 dairy families and they said, under the Safe Drinking Water Act, we, the EPA, have the power to bring an enforcement action against you because we believe the state and local officials have not gone after you appropriately, and there's an emergency that is posed to the public health and safety under the Safe Drinking Water Act that we, EPA, can now swoop in and enforce this against you. And we're going to do that unless you want to voluntarily enter into this consent order. So my dairymen voluntarily entered into, over the course of a year, this is before I was involved, the terms of a consent order with the EPA. The dairies listed are the clients or the dairies that were specifically approached by the EPA, and ultimately 4 of those 5 dairies signed on to the consent order. The only one that did not sign on to the consent order was the last one, the Hawk Dairy. And I'm going to show you the slide soon, but that Cow Palace, Bosma, Liberty, and the DeRuyters, Their facilities are pretty close together. They're right next to each other, and geographically speaking, and they're often referred to as the cluster dairies. You'll see that terminology if you look at this issue. The Hawks were 4 or 5 miles away, and to the east and south, and kind of just physically separate. It never really made sense. While the first 4 were about the same size and close to each other, the Hawks had about 1,000 head. The rest had significantly more. The Hawks just couldn't afford to even engage with the EPA. And before all was said was done, they said, EPA, we can't do it. And they ended up selling all of their cows and going out of business and stopping dairying because they couldn't fight it. They just didn't have the money and frankly didn't have the heart. They just gave up. So they didn't enter into the consent order. This is the other dairies, the other 4. When I talk about the cluster dairies, you can see, it's hard, I know, to read, but I'm just trying to give you a visual depiction here of how they laid out next to each other. So the dairies that are highlighted there, you have on the left the Liberty Bosma in the red. You have the Cow Palace, which is a name you're going to hear because that was the first case on the schedule and that came up for hearing before the judge. The Cow Palace is in purple. And then green are the DeRuyter facilities over there. So they're all sort of close to each other, share some boundaries, are very similar in both in size and type of operation. So those are the ones that are there. What did the consent order that was ultimately entered into with the EPA provide? I've given you a lot of detail there, but there's a couple of things that are undisputed about this consent order. One is the requirements that the dairymen entered into under the consent order are more restrictive than any other dairy in this country. Period. They said, we are going to install groundwater monitoring wells. We're going to do significant soil and water testing. We're going to hire a professional agronomist. We're going to have an irrigation water management plan. We're going to have a field management plan. And all these plans have to go through QA/QC with EPA. That in and of itself is a multi-million-dollar commitment in terms of just hiring the consultants, getting all those in play, not to mention once they're in play, actually keeping track of them and doing it. It is undisputed that those dairies committed to doing more than any other dairy in the country. With respect to the lagoons were a big deal in this case. Our allegation was all of our lagoons meet NRCS standards, which are the national standards that are established for lagoons. And we've alleged that they all meet and they've been regularly inspected by the local conservation people to meet, in fact, the standards. Our nutrient management plans say, in fact, that they meet each of the standards. Under the consent order, we said, we believe they meet all the standards, but if they don't, we commit to physically lining each of the lagoons at the rate of 1 per year. So, again, trying to be proactive, this is that voluntary consent order, trying to commit to do more than anybody else is doing, and in fact, they decided to do this. The consent order itself was entered in March of 2013. It had an 8-year timeline, but it also has the potential for going much further. If at that end of the 8 years, the EPA is not satisfied, the appropriate benchmarks are in place, the appropriate processes are in place, it can be extended indefinitely until EPA is satisfied that its concerns have been met. So it's an initial 8-year term. The other thing that's undisputed is once this was entered into in March of 2013, each of those 4 dairy families has not only imposed it, but has followed it to the letter and has made significant improvements in terms of every marker that there is. There is no dispute that the dairies haven't followed this to the letter of the law, and the EPA has signed off on everything they're required to do. So keep that in mind. Since March 2013, they've not only been under the most restrictive measures, but have actually followed them. So those 2 things are undisputed. All right. So what's RCRA? As I mentioned, it's this Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. It was enacted in the 70s as kind of the clean-up environmental statute. You know, we have the Clean Water Act, we have the Clean Air Act, we have the Safe Drinking Water Act. We have all these specific acts. This act, RCRA, was established because there was industrial waste that was kind of falling, for lack of a better word, falling through the cracks. And there wasn't a specific statute targeted for that. So Congress passed RCRA in the late 70s, and it was intended to cover 2 types of wastes. Hazardous wastes, which are the things that it sounds like, right? The really bad stuff, hazardous chemicals, nuclear plants, those kind of things. And then solid wastes. And what that has been applied to is your municipal land dump. So your dump has to be regulated in some way. RCRA is the statute that applies to your municipal land waste. So at issue here is, okay, what's a solid waste? And that's the statutory definition of solid waste. Any garbage, refuse, and any other discarded material, and it goes on from any of these processes, including agricultural process. And I highlight discarded because that's really what this case is fighting about is animal manure stored, used, and used as fertilizer on growing crops, a discarded material. Is liquid manure stored in NRCS compliant lagoons a discarded material? Those are the legal questions that are presented. And then discarded, because discarded is so important, everybody goes, okay, what do you mean by discarded? That's what you think. Case law has said it's like to throw away, to get rid of. It's disposed of, thrown away, or abandoned, which you think is a pretty straightforward kind of, you understand what that means, right? To throw it away. That's what a dump is. I threw it away. I'm not using it in any meaningful way. I'm discarding it. So that's the legal framework that this case finds itself in, knowing that we're also now subject to the consent order and all those requirements. RCRA, it does have the language, as I pointed out, that a solid waste could include discarded materials from an agricultural operation, but the specific language in the legislative history specifically recognizes that animal manure may be used as either soil conditioners or as fertilizer at an agricultural facility. And they said that's not a discarded material. The legislative history is very specific. And again, not disputed, that animal waste returned to the soil as fertilizer or soil conditioners are not considered discarded under RCRA. So what has happened? For 40 years, more than 40 years, EPA has never applied RCRA against an agricultural operation based on their use, handling, and storage of manure. Now, dairies and animal farmers know you can get in trouble with EPA for a lot of reasons, and have, but it hasn't been RCRA. EPA has never done that. Not until recently. So recently, environmental groups have tried to push the limit of liability and look for new ways to hold people accountable. RCRA is this new way. And so there have been recent attempts to expand RCRA to apply to manure's use, handling, storage. The first real attempt was some of you may know about the Tyson Foods case out of Oklahoma. Their environmentalist groups alleged that the way Tyson Foods used its poultry litter, when it over-applied poultry litter as fertilizer to crops, or when it stored it improperly, that amounted to a discard. In that case, in Oklahoma in 2010, it didn't even make it past the motion to dismiss phase, which means as a matter of law, the federal judge in that case said, RCRA doesn't apply here. These guys are using it as soil conditioners or as fertilizer. End of story. We don't keep asking what happens in 5 years and 10 years. Has every molecule been used for fertilizer, or has some stayed in residuals in the nitrates or phosphorus or what have you in the soil? In that case, the first case, Tyson Foods, the federal court dismissed as a matter of law that RCRA claim. Here comes Yakama. Remember I just told you about the EPA study that pointed the finger at dairies? Well, they were working very much hand in hand with the two environmentalist groups that ended up suing our dairymen. We've had this great, that's who's pushing the study, that's who's pushing, that's why dairies are a problem, and they were hand in hand. We've got emails, we've got all these kind of things showing that there is that direct line of communication. At the same time this report's about to come out, the two groups are a local group, it's called Citizens Against CARE, and then Centers for Food Safety, which is a national group. Those two groups filed notices of intent to sue among each of the 5 dairymen that have been subject to the consent order, just so happened the same 5. What that means is they had to wait a prescribed amount of time before they could sue them. They were alleging RCRA violations. They got these notices and said, I don't even know what RCRA is, and I thought we just entered into this consent order. Aren't we taking care of the problem? Didn't take care of the problem. Immediately after the required time went by, after the notices of intent to sue were filed against these guys, citizen suits were filed against each of those 5 individual dairies. And that just means it doesn't have to be the government, it's, the citizens group that is bringing these claims saying you are harming the public. You are polluting the environment. You're causing a concern that we are now taking up the cause for under RCRA. The case, all 5 cases were filed in the Eastern District of Washington in Yakima, and a new judge, Judge Tom Rice, had just been appointed by Obama and was assigned to all 5 cases. So we had the same judge on all 5 cases. And the allegations in that lawsuit, much like Tyson Foods, was the way that these dairies use, handle, and store manure under the state-approved nutrient management plans violates RCRA's bar against 2 things. One is open dumping, is you just dumped it, and you shouldn't have. And the other one is causing a substantial and imminent endangerment to health and safety. So the 2 claims, open dumping and that. Now, I keep highlighting this, but what happened just at the same time we entered into the EPA consent order, every single thing that is done on those dairies is not only reviewed by, but only can be approved by EPA in terms of what are they doing with their lagoons, what are they doing with their crops, what are they doing with their cows. So that's what we're faced with. How many of you in animal agriculture have lagoons? Store liquid manure, okay? And I'm assuming that they're compliant with NRCS standards, right? You could be discarding, the allegation was that's not good enough. You could be anything that leaches below the level of a lagoon. So NRCS says you have to have a certain permeability for your lagoons. Well, nothing is impermeable, right? So even concrete has a permeability factor. So something could get below that. The allegation was when that something, however much it is, does, that's a discard under RCRA because you can't be using it. So you must be throwing it. Remember the definition: to discard, to throw away, to get rid of. You're not using that as fertilizer. So when you store it in an NRCS compliant lagoon, you are de facto discarding under RCRA. That was the first allegations. The second allegation, and the most complex factually, but simple to understand, is if your corn needs 250 pounds per acre of nitrogen and you apply 300 pounds per acre, 50 is left over, that's not being used as fertilizer, that's a discard. Or if your corn takes 250 and it died and you applied 250 but didn't use 250 because it died, now there's too much nitrogen in the soil, that wasn't used, so that's a discard under RCRA. Those are the allegations. Yeah, wait till you get to the point at the end. Yeah.
Now, where does CAFO for these industries fit in? Because it seems as though in CAFO, it should take care of a lot of their manure. Yes.
Sort of. I mean, the CAFO permit, the NPDES permit, and we've thought a lot about this since we've gotten this decision, and we've talked to EPA, at least in Idaho, and they said that would not cover RCRA liability. Because what an NPDES permit does is it gives you protection if you have a problem for anything that's listed in your permit, right? But if you have, it's the configuration of all these different things. You have a nutrient management plan that says you can apply 250 pounds per acre, right? You apply 250 pounds per acre. It's not a permit, so you don't get a permit shield under your, even though you're following your nutrient management plan. So under the NPDES, well, you're not allowed to discharge from your fields, so you don't get the permit protection that you otherwise would under an NPDES permit. So it's a great question because you're like, well, wait a minute, I got every permit everybody's ever asked me to do, and how could I still be liable? And what my dairymen have said is, look, I just want regulatory certainty. Tell me what the rules are, and I'll follow them. And they thought they were following them. They had a nutrient management plan. They were regularly inspected. If there was ever a problem, and by the way, they were never told there was any big problem. In fact, they had things like good use of nutrients, well-run facility, and I'll come back to that. But so this is under their nutrient plan. They thought they were doing everything right. You hear about bad actors in every industry. These guys aren't bad actors. These aren't the ones that you say, well, we're different. We're not like them. My guys have a nutrient management plan. My guys follow it. My guys have NRCS compliant lagoons. I'm not like them. Yes, you are. If you're run well. If you're run well, you're like them. So, litigation is filed. What happens? A whole bunch of things happen. So what did we do originally? We did what Tyson Foods did. We brought that motion to dismiss. before the court and said, Your Honor, RCRA was never meant to apply to dairies, at least the way this. We got it covered. Not only do we have it covered with the state, who's really the entity that should be looking at this, and who in fact does and regularly inspects us, but we now have a consent order with the EPA. Believe me, people are watching us. There's no reason for this court to come in, and there's this whole legal theory called anti-duplication, right? You shouldn't be able to sue somebody for something that they're already taking care of with another agency. It doesn't seem right. That's part of the reason why our guys did the voluntary consent order. They thought they were buying their piece. It's a big thing to bite off on, but at least you think it would give you some measure of protection, right? I got EPA. EPA says what I'm doing is right, and everything I'm doing is what EPA says I can do. So I shouldn't be facing precedent-setting liability. We brought that motion to dismiss. The judge said, no, I think I want to take a look at this. And the duplication theory, the consent order says you must do A and B. Plaintiffs want A, B, and C. So it's not duplicative. It's not inconsistent. It's just more. So that was the argument, and he's the judge, so he can decide that. We also argued it's not a solid waste under Tyson Foods, that it's precedent setting. It's never been done. He said, well, I understand that it's never been done, but it could be. And I'll let these guys play out the facts, and we'll let some discovery, and you guys can come back, and we'll argue about it then. I'm really, he didn't say that. That's my cynical summary of it later, I understand. But in essence, that's what happened. In the meantime, the Hawks, who were the dairy that went out of business, settled because they didn't have a dairy anymore, and plaintiffs realized it wasn't worth spending time and money for somebody that wasn't operating in dairy anymore. So that case settled out very early, which then opened up the floodgates for discovery. And I have decided that if you ever want to be rich in this world, become an expert. Because, boy, have we spent a lot of money on experts, both sides. Tons and tons of data has been generated under the consent order. Remember, there's soil sampling, quarterly water sampling from the groundwater, pre- and post-harvest samples, yield data. I mean, there's all this kind of data that's being generated and now is publicly available. So that is really free discovery for the plaintiffs because it's under the EPA consent order. It's being generated more than anybody has ever done before. In addition to that, plaintiffs used Federal Rule of Civil Procedure to come on to these dairies and actually do drilling and do soil sampling out in their fields to look at the different facilities. I mean, it's very invasive. You think about what's going on here. And then, of course, various state and local agency personnel, including folks from the Washington State Department of Ag, were deposed. And one thing I want to note, there's a woman named Jenny Prest with the Department of Ag, and she was the head of this dairy program, and she gave great testimony. She says, 30, 40 years ago, these dairies were causing a real problem, but we just didn't have a handle on it. But for the last 10 years or so, since we've had this nutrient management plan, they have made tremendous efforts, as have we, as we've learned more, as technology's gotten better, as science has made us understand soil health better. We're better. Because we don't want to over-apply. That's money out of our pocket. We don't want, in every single way, we want to make the best facility, the healthiest cows, the best crops that we can do. And Ginny is saying the story of the dairies hasn't gotten out. So we talk about marketing and messaging. There was a problem. There still is probably some problem, but it's a heck of a lot better, and it's only getting better. But that story is not part of any of this. And then another thing that happened is, so we had Liberty and Bosma, same ownership, those cases were consolidated. So from the 5 that we had, 1 was dismissed, and then 2 were consolidated. So we're left with 3 cases. And the interesting thing, and what I've added in this last thing, is the dairies themselves were originally sued. What ended up happening is each of the first 2 dairies had people that they leased land from to grow crops and apply liquid manure on their crops. Those entities were brought in as parties, former and current landowners. So if you just owned property that you leased to the dairy and said, grow your crops, do whatever, you are now subject to RCRA liability if they over-apply nutrients to your fields, or if they have a lagoon on your facility, even if it's NRCS compliant. So they brought those people and they were allowed to bring them in. We fought it, but again, lost. On January 13th, Judge Rice, our federal court, we finally were able to bring together all the materials that we gathered over the last 2 years and say, Your Honor, as a matter of law, RCRA doesn't apply. We said it before. We really mean it now. RCRA does not apply to this case. And by the way, we have 2 years of data from the EPA under the consent order that shows it's working. The first case to come up was Cow Palace. They had 7 fields that were subject to the consent order. 5 of the 7 fields had already met their marker of 45 parts per million at the 2-foot level of nitrates under the consent order in those 2 years. So 5 of the 7 and the other 2 were trending downward. We have a professional agronomist. These are, again, undisputed facts. With those undisputed facts before the court said, nope, you guys are the first agricultural operation in the country to be found liable under RCRA for various things. First, even if you have NRCS compliant lagoons, they are, quote, designed to leak. That is a discard under RCRA because you're not going to be using it for any other purpose, and therefore you are subject to liability. I mean, it's a straightforward, he uses that even if they're NRCS compliant, they're designed to leak because they're permeable. That is probably the easiest one to get your hands around and go, that just doesn't make sense. The manure over-applied. As you can imagine, that's a very factually intensive question about how much does a crop need in any particular year, what residuals you have left. Remember, at the time this decision was issued, it was 2 years into the consent order. 5 of the 7 fields were at 45 parts per million or less at the 2-foot level for nitrates, which is more restrictive than anybody else that's doing it. And the court said, nope, that's not good enough. You're posing an imminent and substantial threat to public health and safety because once even 1 molecule of nitrate gets below the root zone, it is destined for groundwater. That's the language he almost universally just incorporated from plaintiffs. At the Cow Palace, it's about 100 feet to groundwater. And it's not sand, it's rock. We had an expert that gave testimony that it took up to 70 years from the time you put a drop of something on the surface before we get to groundwater. The court dismissed that, wasn't concerned. He said it's destined for groundwater, it's just a matter of time. And the last thing he talked about was we have compost areas. Again, these facilities are really innovative. They have these great compost areas that have been certified by USDA. They have digesters. They're putting in a centrifuge, one of them, to get rid of waste and phosphorus that do amazing things. These are guys, like I said, are not bad actors. They're looking for technology to help them in any way. They're looking for solutions and employing them. The court said that when you compost your manure on bare ground, not concrete and not synthetically lined, that amounts to a discard as well. Because some portion of that nitrate will get into the soil, and again, it's destined for groundwater. So composting on native soil, even compacted to a great degree, is a discard under RCRA under Judge Rice's decision. What he left open was the question of cow pens. When your cow pees or poos in its pen, he said, well, that's an issue for trial. I need to figure out if that's a discard under RCRA. Honestly, I couldn't make this up. That literally is something we have to fight about still. At the last minute, the plaintiffs generally didn't focus on it, but they're alleging there's surface water impacts. There's no evidence to show that the facility's built to maintain, not to impact surface water. There's been no evidence of that. But the way this judge is going after us, we really don't think that that's going to matter, what the evidence shows. The last thing left are remediation efforts. So really, the judge found liability, and he left open for trial. What am I going to do about it? What am I going to order these guys to do to meet this problem? Because what he found was by doing all these things, you've done 2 things. Engaged in open dumping, and you pose a substantial and imminent threat to public health and safety, which you don't have to be a lawyer to say, how am I posing a substantial and imminent threat to public health and safety when I am 2 years into a consent order that everybody says I'm following and I've had no issues with? I don't understand it. It seems inconsistent. But in any event, after this decision and everybody's rocking of the world, the other dairymen are like, oh my God, what do I do? See, the way this has worked out with the 3 cases, they're about a month apart, scheduled with the same judge, first case, second case, third case. We get this decision in January, and we say that this judge is not going to change his mind and all of a sudden to say, oh, my bad, NRCS compliant lagoons are good. You're fine. He's not going to change that. Our guys realize that and enter a stipulation that basically says, we disagree but we're not going to go spend a whole bunch of time and money arguing about this in front of the judge. We'll save it as an issue for trial if we need to. So we'll enter into a stipulation so that we can get to a consolidated remedies trial. And we'll fight about this because we don't need to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars bringing motions for summary judgment that are just going to get denied by the judge who just told us what he thinks about this. And that trial is currently set for May 11th. So are you scared? I mean, that's why people don't want me to talk about this case, because it is as scary as it sounds. What can we do given that decision other than appeal? All of us in this room understands that we have to be good stewards of the land and our animals, if we're involved in animal agriculture. So we are trying to do the right thing. And that's what, my clients, they're trying to do the right thing. And as I said before, it feels a little bit like we got a speeding ticket for going the speed limit. We thought we were following the rules, and we just got slapped with a really big decision that says the rules are different, and I've applied them to you. We've been involved in some settlement discussions because, as you can imagine, the dairy is like, I just need to stay in business. If this judge has issued this kind of a decision, what's he going to do at the remediation phase, right? Is he, are they going to tell me that I got to put concrete under every single acre of my pen? We don't have tiles under our fields. We just have fields that with 100 feet to groundwater. Are they going to require us to do something like that? Are they going to take, our hundreds and thousands of acres and basically line them with a synthetic liner or put concrete over everything? It's just ridiculous. It's the worst case scenario has happened in terms of liability. So what's going to happen on remediation? So we've tried to engage plaintiffs in some type of settlement to see if we can live with something, but they are feeling pretty emboldened, as you can imagine, after getting that kind of a decision. We've engaged in a couple of rounds. Without revealing any confidential nature, I can tell you that every time they seem reasonable, they pull back and get emboldened and ask for something that's never, you couldn't do, even if your whole heart wanted it to happen, and go, wait, that's just impractical, and you couldn't do. So my takeaway from this is, and let me just mention something. Some of you might just think, this can only happen in Washington, right? It's never going to happen anywhere else. Have anybody been paying attention to Wisconsin and what's going on there? Environmentalist groups did the same thing they did out in Yakima. They petitioned EPA to do a study to look at dairies' use of manure in a county out there where there's high dairies to engage in this exact same process. They have got the game plan for how to go after this, and it's happening right now in Wisconsin. So it's not an isolated incident. It is, I'm afraid, coming your way. So what can I tell you about, I'm looking for ways to give you a happy, what can I do, Deb? What can I do to make this not go away? Well, don't be in Judge Rice's court is my first thing. But I think really do what you can only do, right? You have a nutrient management plan, and your inspectors are telling you you're doing great. Don't rely on that. Don't rely on it because it didn't work for us. You look at that plan, know the plan. If it tells you you need to do an annual report based on something that nobody's ever asked for, nobody's ever done, nobody's ever collected, do that annual report. If it tells you you must keep X, Y, and Z paperwork, but nobody's ever asked for it, nobody's ever done it, doesn't make any sense, do that paperwork. And keep it for only as long as it says. If it says 5 years, don't keep 6 years, keep 5 years worth of documents. The other thing is be engaged is my biggest question. So a lot of, I was talking to somebody, it's like you go out in a dairy facility anymore, you got to, be a scientist, a PhD. It's like organic chemistry in action, and you have to know so much more than just feed a cow and see what happens. There's so much going on there. A lot of people rely on, as they should, consultants and people to tell them what's going on, know what's going on. We had an incident with one of the dairies where they had hired soil scientists to come out and do their pre- and post-harvest soil sampling, and there were just fundamental mistakes in typing. And we didn't catch it until discovery years later because you just rely on your guy, right? He's going to take care of it. He would tell me if there was a problem. I have a report. I don't know what the report means, but he's telling me I'm okay. But when you go through it methodically, so be engaged, be vigilant in your own paperwork, and know your facility. That's all I can really say. And all these people in the room, you all are engaged in animal agriculture. You all want to do the right thing. So you're not the problem, but there are bad actors out there. I would encourage all of you to spread the word about, we can't do much. We can't get an NPDES permit. to protect us from RCRA. We can't prevent this, but what we can do is if you're in an area that you have either high nitrates or high phosphorus. Idaho is a phosphorus-based nutrient planning. Washington is a nitrate-based nutrient planning. If you have either of those elevated levels in your groundwater, or if you see an increasing trend, I'd be worried, because you could be subject to this kind of a lawsuit. Because as they increase, they say, well, who's the problem? It's, animal ag. It's pork producers, it's cattlemen, it's the dairies, it's anybody that has, that kind of thing. And you're not protected even if you're just a farmer who's leasing land to your dairy and growing crops on it. Because Judge Rice's decision said those entities are also responsible because they have some measure of control over how their land is used.